That would conclude the first section of the introduction to von Balthasar's Glory of the Lord, Seeing the Form. And the constant theme over the last couple of videos has been this idea that Balthasar boldly puts forward, that this idea of form, because only that which has form can we grasp. And that seems obvious, but it's so often taken for granted. We don't think about that in many ways, the better we define the forms which are part of our life and that we think upon and react to and are part of, form who we are and how we act in the world. And it's critical to Christianity because we have the form of Christ. And that form rises above all forms. As a human being, as a real man, he's a unique form. And that's what we need to see and experience to have that transformation. Balthasar says, only that which has form can snatch one up into a state of rapture. Only through form can the lightning bolt of eternal beauty flash. There is a moment in which the bursting light of spirit, as it makes its appearance, completely drenches external form in its rays. From the manner and the measure in which this happens, we know whether we are in the presence of sensual or of spiritual beauty, in the presence of graceful charm or of interior grandeur. A little later on, he brings up the Acts 2:13, I believe it is, where during Pentecost, when the disciples and Mary are experiencing the Holy Spirit first enters upon earth, and they are to some degree joyfully experiencing this. And it says in the Bible that the people were questioning, have they drank too much wine? Because although this, we must always keep in mind during this kind of complicated, sophisticated theology for those of us that have this ability to or desire to study theology, that we must always keep in mind that this needs to lead to beauty, not dry closets of moth-eaten clothes, but of pointing towards the glory of Christ himself, which leads us to the true nature of reality and our experience. And that's why Balthasar says, to be transported, moreover, belongs to the very origin of Christianity. The apostles were transported by what they saw, heard and touched, by everything manifested in the form. You can watch the sun come up here while I explain the lightning flash of beauty that hit my life. I had been married for several years, had 2 children, and like a lot of people and marriages, there was struggles. And I was having a really hard time. One morning in February, I got in a pretty heated argument with my wife, and I was just crushed. I had been trying to find meaning. My whole life I had read all philosophers, different spiritual thinkers, Eastern philosophies, esotericism, everything. I'd been trying everything. So just to remove myself out of the house, I left for the day. We live in the countryside, and the closest Starbucks is about 35 miles away. So I drove up there I had a book on Buddhism and a book on Nietzsche. And I went to the Starbucks just to calm down and have some coffee, which was always one of my favorite things to do in the morning, is go have a cup of coffee somewhere and read. And I'd calmed down, was relaxed enough to come back home, and I thought I would get a refill for the road. So I went up to the counter to get one more refill, and in front of me there was a man, and I heard him say seminary. And I was just kind of curious, so I said, "Seminary? You went to seminary?" He said, "Yes, I'm a minister." He happened to be the minister from a church only, United Church of Christ, only about 3 miles from my house. So I decided to sit down with him at Starbucks and talk to him for a while. He was about my age. So we sat down, and he said he had come from Long Island. He had a conversion of faith. Several years previous, he became a minister, and this was his first church that he'd been part of. It was a very small, struggling United Church of Christ with a couple old families kind of trying to make one last stab at keeping the church open. Said he was very depressed, was having a really hard time. People are yelling at him. And I felt sorry for him, but it kind of reinforced to me why Christianity doesn't work. And he offered, it was a Saturday, so he said, "Why don't you come to church the next day?" I kind of chuckled to myself and didn't think I was going to do that. But we exchanged numbers, and I thought maybe I could have him over since he was depressed here where we live out in the countryside and things weren't going well for him. So I left, came back, told my wife the story about the minister I met at Starbucks. And it came to the next day. It was just kind of a boring, cold day in February up here in way upstate New York. And it was about 15 minutes before the service started. And I said, I think I'm just going to, out of support of that minister, I think I'm going to go up and go to the church. So I had to run upstairs, throw some clothes on, ran out the door, and drove real fast to get to the church. And I, very nervous, but walked in. And when he saw me, his arms flew up in the air. He was so excited that I had decided to come. It happened to be the local newspaper was actually doing a article on this church trying to reopen. So I was very nervous about being there. Originally, I was even more nervous. I was like, wow, I'm going to be in the paper now, and my cool friends who aren't Christians will see this, and that would be real embarrassing. So met a few people, and then the service began. And right off the bat, the second he started speaking, I felt very embarrassed. I was embarrassed because I suddenly realized that I had been fighting against Christianity my whole life. And I instantly knew that this was going to have a serious effect, to put it mildly, for the rest of my life. And I was instantly, at least, convicted that I needed to pursue my understanding of Christianity to degrees that I hadn't yet. And so that started a journey for me to seek the revelation of Jesus Christ. And it was a long, winding path of difficulties. But it is that lightning flash that hits us all when we are what we call converted and then go through the conversion process. That is the form that begins the process of changing our own form. for those that have a conversion to the Christian faith, there's the interjection of God into our lives. And we all have many different ways and stories how that can occur. And it's always important to give your testimony. So I gave you a little bit of mine in the very beginning when that lightning flash of inspiration hit me. And I realized that I'd be working out the ramifications for the rest of my life, which I have up until now. Speak about the last part of this first section of the introduction to Glory of the Lord, seeing the form, because Balthasar brings up something very interesting and controversial. I'm sorry I often mispronounce words or names, but Balthasar had a spiritual connection with Adrienne von Speer. She was a mystic, and he obtained great knowledge and wisdom from her. But that's also a point of controversy, and we experience that throughout the Christian churches, and especially Catholicism, that has a long history of mysticism, private revelation, how we relate that to the revelation of the church, Christ. Where is it correct? Where is it wrong? Where is it misleading? Where is it leading to the glory of God? As we know, all things are judged by their fruit. And so Balthasar brings up this idea here in the end about a word that a lot of Catholicism doesn't like, esotericism. So it's concluding a couple paragraphs here for the end of the first section. He says, speaking of once the apostles knew what was happening and became more clear, their lives changed dramatically. And he says, how cowardly a flight from the world would the apostles' act of forsaking all things in order to follow Christ be, if it were not moved by the folly of that enthusiasm which even Plato knew in his own way, and which every person knows who, for the sake of beauty, gladly becomes a fool without giving it a second thought. So what is the difference between a Christian experiencing what we will know as the highest beauty possible, the revelation of Christ on earth, the form of Christ, the beauty of Christ, and the so many things in the world that are beautiful and that can transport us? Because a lot of people are going to be driven by beauty without professing any Christian faith. And so what's the difference? How do we know? I think, first of all, one of the most clear ways we can know the difference is for those of us that profess Christ, which I think is critical, which is why I'm starting to do these videos, is professing that the reason we are joyous, the reason why we are Christians, is because we have been transformed, and now we see the world in a different light, and then we profess to the cause of that being Christ. Because the beauty that Satan's kingdom offers is tremendous, but we need to see that as often as a hollow temptation that takes us away from God. He continues, both the person who is transported by natural beauty and the one snatched up by the beauty of Christ must appear to the world to be fools, and the world will attempt to explain their state in terms of psychological or even physiological laws, which is what he's talking about when he talks about Acts 2:13, when the Pentecost, and the people around who haven't received the revelation of Christ see Mary and the disciples, the people starting to follow them, acting very joyously, and they ask, are they drinking too much wine? Because to the outside, the forms that we all share in the world, bodies, life, personalities, our daily routines, all these things, nothing really stands out from a Christian or a non-Christian. But we must be able to distinguish ourselves and know that which we follow as opposed to others who don't profess. He continues, but they know not what they have seen, and they care not one farthing what people may say. They suffer because of their love, and it is only the fact that they have been inflamed by the most sublime of beauties, a beauty crowned with thorns and crucified, that justifies their sharing in that suffering. So this is where we must always be clear that what we are pointing towards, what we are looking at, is Christ crucified, the resurrected Christ. St. Paul says if he's not resurrected, then all of our faith is in vain. And even as Christians, we will be influenced by the different beauties of the world to perhaps participate in them, but our participation will perhaps be different and or more joyous because we can put it in its proper perspective. Your heart is where your treasure is, as Jesus says. So lastly, Balthasar brings up in the last couple sentences here in this first part of the introduction, he brings up this word, once again, that sometimes he's considered fairly controversial because of this. He says, a certain esotericism is unavoidable, and where the proofs for truth contemplated necessarily bear the character of a ritual initiation, as the symposium showed long ago. Even so, truly, a church of the people, as the Catholic Church, does not abolish genuine esotericism. The secret path of the saints is never denied to one who is really willing to follow it. But who in the crowd troubles himself over such a path? We know in our creed that we speak to the communion of saints, which was a very influential part for me in discovering the joys of the Catholic faith. All the internal happenings within ourselves are sometimes beyond words, hard to express, but absolutely form a great part of our faith. Even we know St. Joseph in a difficult time has a dream and tells him what to do via the dream, to take Mary to Egypt. Now, the dreams we have and the places we go in our mind may sometimes lead us to greater understanding, or could be a deception. This is what we must always weigh. And this is what we weigh in the church often with apparitions, private revelations, mystics. But that direct source of knowledge, when and if it is via the Trinity, then it fructifies our faith. It bears good fruit. And we can see with Balthasar that his theology is going to be built on something and thoughts and ideas that often are cast aside and have made him sometimes be controversial or rejected. But in that same vein, the broadness which he brings to things, this new perspective, I read somewhere that he's the first theologian that kind of had a level of freedom that hadn't occurred yet. And then he can survey all of history up until modern times here, what has occurred in the church. and look at it in ways just before the Second Vatican Council, and give us a new take on these things. And he had very unique experiences himself. He had a mystical experience that brought him into the church. So for those of us that definitely came from a path of esotericism, which can be intoxicating and alluring to so many and has really taken over much of the world, when we have our focus on the proper objective, on the proper form of Christ, we can then weigh and experience these things in its proper relation to that, and we can cast aside, throw to the fire what doesn't belong there. And so I can end this first part of the introduction. We'll start studying the next part, and we'll do some future videos. Thank you so much.